So this class is about political parties as they participate in our electoral system and the impact they have on the way that people compete in that electoral system and the political outcomes that we get. This first lecture of Module 1 is about the origin of the party system, and we have to talk about the origin of the party system, and it's an interesting topic because our Constitution doesn't mention parties. Our constitutional system doesn't build in political parties into the fundamental design, and in fact, at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates who wrote the Constitution not only didn't think that parties should exist, they kind of, and I would say a little naively, believed that they wouldn't develop. It's not that they didn't know about political parties. There were parties and partisanship in Great Britain, so they'd seen it. They hoped that what there would be is there would be multiple factions that people would organize around certain ideas and interests and compete in the political system. They didn't believe there wouldn't be competition. They didn't believe that groups wouldn't work towards advancing their goals and trying to get victories. They just didn't believe and they didn't want parties to form. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the original parties that did form were formed by the same generation of politicians who wrote the Constitution, and was actually formed by some of the people who were at the convention itself who didn't design or build in parties into our system. So why did it happen? How did the steps that were taken get to the kind of modern political party system that we have? And why do we have a two-party system with the two particular parties that we have? In subsequent elections, I'm going to talk about the evolution of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and that'll kind of pick up on the story where I leave off at the end of this lecture as to how these particular parties developed. But I will talk about the original two parties that are kind of the spiritual forefathers of the two modern political parties. So why do we have parties in the first place? We're so familiar with them, it almost seems like a ridiculous question. Why are there parties? But in the very first presidential administration, the Washington administration, there weren't political parties. The first American election in 1788 didn't include parties. Now, there wasn't real meaningful competition for the presidency either, and the election for the seats in Congress took place in a way that kind of organized around factions and individual candidates. And they were, state by state. So it's not as though there weren't party-like entities in each of the different states. It's just that there were no national parties. And because there was really no competition for the presidency, it was George Washington in those two elections was more or less uncontested. There didn't need to be any kind of parties to support presidential nominees. And in fact, originally, what the delegates to the Constitutional Convention hoped was that the presidency would be such a big prize, such a coveted office, that sort of the best and the brightest political elites would compete for it, and so there would be this individual competition for the presidency. Of course, we know the system where we have the two major party nominees, and I'm going to talk today about how it is that we got from this idea that the best and the brightest, the sort of elite of the political elite would be competing for the presidency. How do we get from there to here? But that story starts first during the Washington administration. One of the things about George Washington was that he was not a partisan. He was not a person who had party leanings. He didn't have a particular policy orientation. He definitely didn't have a platform. He was really the consensus choice to both be the president of the Constitutional Convention as well as to be the first president of the United States, largely because of his kind of non-partisan, non-policy-oriented perspective. He didn't have a vision for the direction that America should go. He didn't have an idea about what kinds of policies would take us in that direction. He didn't have a perspective on who was the core of the American people that should be nurtured and benefited and cultivated. He didn't have any of the ideas about sort of the present or future of the American people or the American nation that would turn into a party platform or a policy agenda or some kind of ideology. But plenty of other people did, and in fact, all of the people that surrounded Washington, the people in his cabinet, his vice president, John Adams, his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, these people and the members who were elected to Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, they had ideas about the direction the country should go, who were the Americans that most deserved protection from the government, benefits from the government, recognition that they were part of the people. They all had different ideas, and their different perspectives led them to support different types of policies. One of the things that Washington did well was he surrounded himself with people who had different views. Now, he did make decisions, and he did end up supporting particular policies, and his administration did go in a particular direction. Washington is sometimes listed in textbooks and in history books or called a Federalist. And sometimes he's listed as unaffiliated or non-aligned or independent. Both of those are true in this sense. The Federalist Party didn't exist, and George Washington was certainly not the nominee of the Federalist Party, and he did not consider himself a Federalist. But the Federalist Party organized within his administration during his presidency, and it was organized by primarily the Vice President, John Adams, and the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who both shared a view of the direction America should go. They both shared a view of our foreign policy, our domestic policy. They shared an idea about how the Constitution ought to be interpreted. They shared a perspective on the power and scope of federal power versus state power. And that set of ideas was what they pushed for in cabinet meetings and in policy meetings and in Congress. And largely they won, and Washington sided with them and pushed for what would be known as Federalist policy. So while Washington himself was not a Federalist, he ended up being, in terms of policy and perspective, he ended up playing a Federalist, in office. Now, the reason why Adams and Hamilton decided that it was important to organize a party was because they understood that you needed victories in Congress, and you needed control over the executive branch to be able to forward a particular agenda. They understood how politics works. They were participating in it, and they realized that in order to win these elections, it would be beneficial to have a party name, a party brand, some kind of collective support network to help get different candidates elected. Hamilton himself had been involved in a very important political endeavor, which was pushing for ratification of the Constitution in the state of New York, and he understood that in order to get that done, and he helped write the Federalist Papers, that you needed an organization, you needed something that was coordinated, you needed a cohesive perspective to make that argument, to make that case. So he had experience with what we can think of as kind of early proto-partisan politics. Even before the Constitution was ratified, there was the Federalist wasn't a party, but there was definitely a faction pushing for ratification. One of the ironies, of course, is that the other major author of the Federalist Papers, James Madison, eventually, very quickly actually, became a party leader in the party that opposed the Federalist Party. So Madison himself helped out with the Federalist cause, participated in this collective effort that Hamilton was a leader of to get the Constitution ratified in the state of New York, and then later, because he had a different policy orientation, he ended up being on the different side from Alexander Hamilton and being his political opponent when they had been political allies. But Hamilton had this experience, and he was inside the cabinet, and he knew that it was beneficial to have members of Congress who aligned with his perspective to vote for bills that Washington could sign and to promote his policies. And so there was the idea that, okay, we need more people in Congress rather than fewer. And instead of leaving that up to chance, you're the Secretary of Treasury, and you don't want to just take the Congress as it's handed to you by the voters and work with it. You want, as party leaders always have wanted ever since then, you want to have a favorable majority. How do you get a favorable majority? You form a group that works together. Now, the Federalists actually had a name and a symbol. It was kind of this black and white flower symbol. It was very, kind of from our perspective, the Federalist Party itself was not extraordinarily organized or well structured. It definitely didn't look like or compete in the way that modern political parties would compete. It wasn't really until the Jacksonian era that the modern political party as we know it, doing the things that we know, evolved. But the Federalist Party was definitely a self-identified group, self-labeled. They had a brand, they had an agenda, and they were competing in elections. So the Federalist Party formed from within the Washington administration. Now, Thomas Jefferson had a very different view of the direction America should go and the way the Constitution should be interpreted and the orientation to our foreign policy. And in just general terms, the Federalists, Hamilton and Adams, wanted to have an active, powerful central government. They wanted to be able to interpret the Constitution expansively so that those powers could be, the implied powers could be used. They wanted to have a pro-industrial, pro-capitalist, pro-economic growth-oriented domestic policy. They wanted to have a pro-British foreign policy, and they were interested in controlling Congress to the best they could to be able to forward this particular agenda. Jefferson and Madison, who didn't have a party quite yet, and they would soon, but they didn't quite yet, they basically were on the opposite side of all these questions. They believed the Constitution ought to be interpreted narrowly, that the federal government ought to be relatively small and contained, and that states ought to do a lot of the work, that the domestic policy ought to be oriented not towards the capitalist class, the merchants, the bankers, the traders, but towards small farmers and plantation owners, that they foresaw not an industrial capitalist future, but an agrarian sort of self-sufficient economy. That's the America they wanted. And in foreign policy, they actually wanted to support and align with France, not Great Britain. France, who had been our ally in the American Revolution, and France, which at the time seemed to have the same kinds of values that America had, whereas Britain had been our foe in the American Revolution. And even though there were definitely important cultural affinities, especially a language and a lot of economic similarities, that Britain, who was the enemy of France, was really not a natural ally for the United States. So in terms of foreign policy orientation, France or Britain, domestic policy orientation, looking towards an industrial capitalist future for America or an agrarian self-sufficient future for America, and in terms of interpreting the Constitution broadly so that the federal government could have an expansive set of powers, or narrowly so that the federal government really was not that big or important. These were the two sets of ideas around which the original parties coalesced, and Adams and Hamilton realized early, and Jefferson and Madison realized later when they saw their policies losing and when they saw the people who supported these views not getting elected as much as the Federalists were, that there was a benefit to this kind of centralized national organization. That rather than leaving elections up to locals who would try to run candidates who maybe leaned in your direction, the idea would be we form a national party that promotes this agenda, that helps candidates, that has a name, that has some kind of brand and orientation to compete against the Federalists. So really what happened was Hamilton and Adams, who were really very good hardball politicians, they understood what it took to get things across the finish line. They recognized early, before even really the first competitive elections, presidential elections at least, that it would be beneficial to have a name, a brand, an orientation, a national direction, and collective support. Jefferson and Madison, and it was really more Madison, he was really the more hardball politician. Jefferson was still really kind of the philosopher during the Washington administration. They realized in a responsive way, well, if we're going to not lose all the time, if the Federalists aren't going to get their way in every debate and win every election, control Congress, and control the direction of the country into the future, we'd better get organized as well. Now, the Federalists were both better at party organization, and then they were worse because they made a critical mistake. After the first competitive presidential election, 1796, where Vice President Adams and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson ran against each other, Adams won the election, and it wasn't too surprising. He was a better politician. The Federalist Party was organized. The Madison-Jefferson people were still hadn't pulled it together yet. Adams won. Now, under the original constitutional scheme for presidential elections, the president was the one who won the most electoral votes, as long as it was the majority, and the vice president was the runner-up. So if you came in second, you got to be the vice president. Thomas Jefferson came in second, and therefore Jefferson was the vice president. Now, the Adams administration was quite different from the Washington administration in the sense that Adams himself didn't really welcome the kind of diversity of opinion that Washington had. Adams had an orientation, and Washington didn't. Washington moved in, or was moved by the successes of Adams and Hamilton in the Federalist direction, but he wasn't really a Federalist. Adams was definitely a Federalist. The Congress was controlled by self-identified Federalists. Both the House and the Senate had Federalist majorities. And the other members of Congress weren't really anything else. They were just not Federalists. So Adams had a unified government, and he had a non-Federalist vice president. Jefferson, recognizing that the role of the vice president was relatively skimpy, and that if the president didn't want to listen to him or pay attention to him or have his voice be heard at cabinet meetings, his presence was relatively unnecessary, and it wasn't effective at all. So Jefferson basically kind of just went home. He didn't really do much as vice president. He certainly didn't participate in the Adams administration with the same kind of vigor that he participated in the Washington administration, or with the same kind of vigor that Washington's vice president Adams had participated in the Washington administration. So Adams basically had unified government, as well as a unified cabinet, an administration that was looking in a particular direction. Looking ahead to future elections, what the Federalists knew they wanted to do was to be able to keep winning. And in order to keep winning, they believed that it was important to harm the opponents, the opposition, the Jeffersonian, Madisonian leaners, the people who wanted that agenda. And Adams pushed for, and Congress passed, two important laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, just before the 1798 midterm elections. And basically what these acts did, they were extraordinarily partisan, because they, one, the Alien Act allowed the president to deport aliens for certain crimes or certain offenses. And what Adams did was he rounded up and got rid of a lot of French Americans, people who either were born in France and moved, or people who had French origins, who sided with the Jeffersonian Madisonians on the idea of aligning America with France. He basically just, attempted to get rid of that demographic, which was a Jefferson-Madison supporting demographic. The Sedition Act was even worse, because what the Sedition Act did was it made criticism of the government illegal. And the Adams administration rounded up and jailed pro-Jeffersonian, pro-Madisonian, anti-Federalist newspaper editors and journalists, as well as political activists, and basically used censorship to squash the voice of their political opponents. Now, I said earlier that the Federalists were both very good and not very good. They were really good at early organization. They were really good at recognizing the benefits of this kind of brand and organization and collective coordination. They weren't good at understanding American politics, American electoral politics. And they can't really be blamed, because there wasn't much American electoral politics that existed that they could look at. They had, in terms of the constitutional system, they had less than a decade of experience. In terms of American elections, they had only less than 20 years, right? The first elections started in the late 1770s. They didn't really know, and they really hadn't seen what would happen in an increasingly partisan environment. In an environment where voters were now adjusting, and political actors were adjusting to this new constitutional system. And what happened, not in 1798, because it was too quick of an election after they passed the Alien and Sedition Act for voters to engage in a backlash, but the election of 1800, a presidential election year, a repeat of 1796 in terms of the competitors, Adams running against Jefferson. All of the members of Congress, not all the senators, but a third of them, and all of the members of the House running for re-election, all these Federalists. And what ends up happening is the American people, in the first wave election in history, looked at the Alien and Sedition Acts and said, this is not the kind of government that we want, and we're going to vote for the other people. Now, the other people had, between 1798 and 1800, had woken up. Jefferson and Madison, seeing the Alien and Sedition Acts, seeing that there was a strong Federalist majority in both houses of Congress, seeing this strong policy orientation in the Adams administration, they realized, a little late but quickly, and not too terribly late, that it was important to play this party game, to form a party and to campaign collectively, to organize collectively, to have a brand and a name and an agenda. Now, the Jeffersonian-Madisonian party never got a name, and history books refer to their party in a variety of ways. They're sometimes called the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, the Jeffersonian Democrats, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. There's a variety of names, and part of the reason for that is they never actually gave themselves a name. The Federalist Party gave itself a name, and it had a logo, and so we can point to that. The Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, which we could just call the Democrats because it did that's probably the simplest way to think of it. They were more loosely organized, but they had a policy orientation. They had a basic platform. They had a national standard bearer who was Thomas Jefferson, who competed against Adams, this time not as Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, but as Thomas Jefferson Democratic Republican versus John Adams Federalist. Now, neither party had a convention in the way that we know, and neither party really sort of selected their nominee in any kind of process other than it seemed pretty obvious. I mean, Adams was the incumbent, so of course he was going to be the Federalist standard bearer. Jefferson was the most prominent in that party, and he had been he was the sitting vice president, so he was also a natural. But we didn't get the party caucus and party conventions until into the 19th century to choose these nominees. Now, what we did have for the first time in 1800 also were running mates. So Adams runs for president, and he has a running mate, and I forget the name of the running mate. I should know it, but I always forget it. Jefferson has a running mate, Aaron Burr, and they're running as a ticket, but it's not the kind of ticket that we know. It's just, hey, vote for us. Now, every elector in the original system gets 2 electoral votes, and the winner of the majority becomes the president, and second place becomes the vice president. Now, because the electors who support the Jefferson-Burr ticket are going to cast 2 votes, if they each cast 1 vote for Jefferson and 1 vote for Burr, then Burr and Jefferson will have the same number of electoral votes, and it will be a tie. And no one will have the majority, and in that case, the backup system in the original Constitution, that the House of Representatives will choose the president from among the top 3 vote getters, the top 2 vote getters, voting in delegations by state. So each state gets 1 vote in the House of Representatives. So the members of the House from each of the states collectively gets 1 vote to cast. And that's exactly what happens. There was a ham-handed and obviously failed attempt to get one of the electors or several of the electors who were for the Jefferson-Burr ticket to cast their second electoral vote for somebody besides Aaron Burr, but they messed it up. They didn't have email. They didn't have the kind of communication that would allow that sort of coordination, and they weren't really very good. They weren't really a party quite yet. So Burr and Jefferson end up with the same number of electoral votes, which means it was a tie, and it goes to the House of Representatives to decide. Now, I won't get into this story, and if you've seen the musical Hamilton, you probably know more about this election than I can tell you in just a couple minutes. But in the end, Jefferson gets selected, and Aaron Burr becomes the vice president. The important thing about this outcome is that the American political elite, seeing this outcome and realizing that this was not the way the Electoral College was intended to work. We weren't supposed to have a tie. And the reason it wasn't supposed to work this way, and there weren't supposed to be ties, was because the designers of the Electoral College didn't envision running mates, because they didn't think about parties, and they had no experience with the idea that a group of people would form a national organization and put forward a presidential and vice presidential candidate. So they hadn't foreseen this bizarre outcome. And they quickly remedied that by writing the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment separated the electoral votes. Each elector got 2 votes, but they cast 1 of those votes for president, and whoever got the majority of those votes became the president, and they cast 1 of those for vice president, and whoever got the majority of those became the vice president. So no longer is the vice president the runner-up in the presidential election. The vice president is now the winner of the vice presidential electoral college, and the president is the winner of the presidential electoral college. And what this does really is this institutionalizes the party ticket. And it means that the vice president is no longer going to be a political opponent of the president, like happened for the first, essentially just the one time when Adams won and the runner-up Jefferson was his vice president. Now the vice president will be a partisan, a part of the ticket. And ever since the 12th Amendment passed, we've had parties putting forward a presidential, vice presidential ticket, and they don't have to worry about that screw-up that happened in the election of 1800 where Jefferson and Burr got the same number of votes, because the 18th Amendment fixed that. But what the 12th Amendment passed in 1803, what the 12th Amendment did was it institutionalized the party ticket and basically took the first step, even without using the words party, towards creating an institutionalized electoral system that had major parties as the major participants. Now, in order to win the presidency, you have to get the majority of votes, just like before, but now you're going to be running for that with a party standard bearer. What happened in the election of 1800, sort of informally, where the Federalists had their ticket and the Democratic Republicans had their ticket, would then now become the norm going forward. Now, the thing that happened too is not only did Jefferson win, though it took some complicated maneuvering in the House of Representatives to go through the sort of constitutional weirdness of this tie to get him selected president, but the Federalists got wiped out in the congressional elections. And the Democratic Republicans now had unified government in the opposite type of the Federalists. They now had Democratic Republican partisans in the executive branch and controlling both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this sort of taught a lesson to the American political elite that, one, the American people were going to respond, the American voters, and at this point the voting population was actually a small minority of the actual population, but American voters were going to respond negatively to the party in power if that party did something that it didn't like. So as I say, the election of 1800 was the first wave election. It was not only a victory for the out party, the incumbent lost, but it was a flip of both houses of Congress. So we went from unified government in the hands of one party to unified government in the hands of the other. The first wave election, and that lesson of a wave election, of the potential for a wave election, was learned and has been relearned by every generation of American politicians, that the American voter will punish the in-party if it does things it doesn't like. The Alien and Sedition Act was extraordinarily unpopular. It was clearly an act of partisan power. It was an attempt for the Federalists to put their foot in the throat of their political opponents and jail them and deport them. And the American people responded by saying, that is not how we want our democracy to go. And it was a great result. The election of 1800 was a fantastic result because it showed that the American voter was going to actually engage in a kind of political retribution to the in-party for, in this case, overreach. In the future, it would be failure to follow through on promises. It would be bumbling the economy so that there was a bad economy. There have been a lot of reactive elections in American history. And what it also taught party leaders was that when you win, when you have control over the various institutions of the federal government, in order to keep winning, not only do you have to have a party organization to help you do that, but you want to give the American voter some satisfaction. You definitely don't want to piss them off because they will be reactive against you. Now, one of the other things that happened in the election of 1800 that was fantastic is that it was the first peaceful transition of power from not one administration to another, because that had happened from the Washington administration to the Adams administration, but from one party to another. The Adams administration, Federalists, were leaving, and they were turning over the keys to a Democratic Republican administration, which had a very different set of priorities and a very different set of policies that they wanted to push for. Another precedent was set. Not just was there a peaceful transfer of power, but there was political gamesmanship. Because what the outgoing Adams administration did was took refuge in the judiciary. The judicial branch of the federal government is staffed by people who have lifetime appointments. And so once you have a position, you can't be removed by elections. You can be removed by impeachment, which is a cumbersome process. The lame duck Federalist Congress created a bunch of new judicial positions. Adams filled those positions as well as filled a couple of vacancies on the Supreme Court. And essentially what the Federalists did was they said, well, we lost this election, but we're going to take refuge with our set of ideas in the judiciary. And while the Federalist Party never bounced back electorally, we never had a Federalist president again, we never had a Federalist majority in either the House or the Senate again, and the Federalist Party name more or less was dead by the end of the 1800s, by 1810. The Federalist Judges lived a really long time, and probably the most important Federalist appointee was Chief Justice John Marshall, who served 35 years as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was an extremely influential justice who had influence on a lot of the justices who served under him, and he put the Federalist stamp on judicial policy. And so the Federalists lost big. They disappeared pretty quickly, but they took refuge in the judiciary and had a multi-generational impact on American policy going forward. And in fact, the precedents that were set during the Marshall Court with Marshall's very Federalist view, that especially not a foreign policy or even economic policy, because the judiciary doesn't really have a hand in that, so much as on interpretation of the Constitution. The Federalists lost that election, but they took refuge in the judiciary. Another lesson that was learned by future generations of partisans and party leaders is that the judiciary is a great place to have power because it lasts well beyond elections. If the American people are going to occasionally rain down retribution on the in-party in the form of a wave election, then the judiciary is protected from that reign of change, and that's a place to put your emphasis. And it shouldn't be too surprising to you to know that, yes, that's actually, that notion, that lesson has still been learned, and it's a huge part of obviously present-day politics. And certainly I'm standing here several days after the death of Supreme Court Justice, and it's only a few weeks until a presidential election, and the Republicans, fearful of being voted out, are trying to fill that vacancy and are certainly going to try to put through as many more judicial appointments as they can between now and January. That is American politics that's 220 years old. That's not brand new. That goes all the way back. Because what a party is an organization that is intended to advance its political aims. Some of those political aims can be advanced by winning elections. Other of those political aims, and some of the same ones, they overlap, can be advanced by controlling the judicial branch. So the election of 1800 had it was a precedent-setting and profound impact on American politics. It begins the solidification of the party system, and it taught some lessons that party leaders and partisans going forward for the next 2+ centuries would heed. Now, there's more to say about how the parties themselves evolved during the early 19th century between the election of 1800 and the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, which really inaugurates the modern party system. And there's a lot to say between 1800 and the 1850s, when the Republican Party emerges and becomes one of the two major parties that we've had since the 1850s. This is I'm going to conclude the story of the origin of the party system here, because I can deal with all those issues when I talk about the evolution of the Democratic Party and the evolution of the Republican Party in the next set of lectures.